Steam locomotives come in all shapes and sizes to do all manners of work, be it compact to make it easier shunting around mines and factories, or ridiculously large to haul long, heavy goods trains over steep gradients. Naturally, the more impressive and eye-catching engines tend to be much bigger and grand in appearance, but there exists one engine that reminds us that size isn't everything. In 1892, work began on a new line for the Lancashire, Derbyshire and East Coast Railway connecting Chesterfield to Lincoln, along with the construction of several other branch lines. Businessman William Becket and his brother Samuel dealt in seed and corn, with William running business in West Norfolk while Samuel operated in Chesterfield. Samuel farmed 385 acres of land along the new railway line, and so William had an interest in the line's development, not only as it would be beneficial to their business, but also because he was somewhat of a rail enthusiast. William Becket thus decided he wanted his own private engine, though it's not entirely known what his reasoning was for getting one. It's widely believed that he simply wanted an engine he could travel around in to do business, while others have speculated that it was for use on the dockyard railway he owned, or that it was simply an act of a businessman fulfilling a long-time dream of owning his own steam engine. Regardless, he contacted A. Dodman & Company Limited and ordered a locomotive. Dodman built traction engines and fairground equipment, but were known to repair smaller shunting engines for nearby railways, and so took on the job, creating from scratch possibly the only steam locomotive in the company's history. By January of 1893, the engine was complete, and the result certainly looked like something cobbled together out of spare fairground parts. The engine was a tiny, single-driving 222. Its cylinders were 4 inches in diameter, its driving wheels were 3 foot 9 inches wide, it weighed just over 5 tons, and stood a total of 7 foot 9 inches tall. To put that into perspective, Tallychlyn, a narrow-gauge locomotive built nearly 30 years earlier, is longer, heavier, and has bigger cylinders than this standard-gauge design. Despite not having a cab, the engine did possess some basic comforts, such as passenger seating in place of its bunker and wooden wheels for a quieter and more comfortable ride. Named Gazelle, it was taken for a trial run from King's Lynn to Downham Market and back, where on the return trip it reportedly averaged a speed of 43 miles an hour. It was taken back to the works for some minor adjustments before being handed over to Becket. In total, Gazelle had cost Becket about £250. In 1897, with permission from the railway, he travelled 105 miles on Gazelle from King's Lynn to Chesterfield, making the run in 5 hours and 10 minutes, and the return trip in 5 hours 25 minutes. Despite Gazelle proving to be a reliable little chariot, records indicate that it was rarely used by Becket, likely due to him pushing 70, and after his brother Samuel died in 1898, he seemingly never used it again. He tried to sell Gazelle in 1900, but with no luck, and as a result it was put to one side. William Becket died in 1906, and with nobody interested in keeping the engine, it was eventually sold to a scrap dealer in 1909. In 1911, Gazelle was picked up cheap by Colonel Stevens for use as an inspection engine on the Shropshire and Montgomeryshire Railway. After a few months of work, Stevens had Gazelle modified, converting it to an 042 with smaller driving wheels and a few smaller adjustments to help it run on the line. Once the line was fully opened in 1912, passenger traffic was very light, and so Gazelle was repurposed again as a passenger engine. But instead of pulling a carriage, passengers would ride on the seats in Gazelle's bunker. After a complaint from a local vicar, Stevens had Gazelle fitted with a cab and a separate compartment for passengers. The compartment had a luggage rack fixed on its roof, which was a foot lower than that of the cab, was entirely enclosed with small windows, a door that only half filled the doorway left passengers exposed to the elements, and was described as having all the welcome appearance of a portable prison cell. It's likely Gazelle was only used like this on quiet days, but by 1916 it was decided it would be much better if it instead pulled a carriage. The carriage was made of an old horse-drawn tram that had been modified to run on the railway, as any other conventional carriage would have likely been too heavy to pull. The introduction of rail motors to the line and a decrease in traffic resulted in Gazelle being stripped down in Kinnerley Yard by 1932. However, William Austin, who took over from Colonel Stevens, felt Gazelle still had some use, and put it back to work in 1937 as an inspection engine and for pulling private parties. The Shropshire and Montgomeryshire Railway was eventually taken over in 1941 by the War Department, due to all the factories and ammunition storage sites it served. Obviously, Gazelle wasn't cut out for the goods work, but did still help the railway by running ahead of important trains to ensure all points were set correctly and to counteract any attempts to sabotage the line, occasionally moving small loads of ammunition. Gazelle came out with a few war wounds for its trouble too, losing the top of its chimney and being bashed in a shunting accident. A petrol trolley soon took over Gazelle's job, and it once again ended up stored in a siding. But for many of the men working the line, Gazelle had become a sort of mascot. As such, when British Railways took over the line in 1950, they gave it to the War Department on permanent loan. Gazelle was put on display at the Longmoor Military Railway, later moving between various museums before finally making its home at the Colonel Stevens Railway Museum at Tenterden. It's still debated whether or not Gazelle is the smallest standard gauge steam locomotive in the world. I suppose it depends on how you measure it. But for an engine of its size, especially one built out of spare fairground equipment and traction engine parts, to go through so much, you have to admit it's certainly earned its place in preservation. Just goes to show that biggest doesn't always mean best, and that the little things can often go a long way. One-off experimental locomotives come and go, as is their nature as experiments. Many are often remembered in railway circles for their unique design and questionable performance, some more so than others. But there is one engine that, by all rights, should have been lost to obscurity decades ago, which has managed to stay in the limelight in an unconventional way. Built in 1902, number 101 was an experimental tank engine designed by George Jackson Churchwood for the Great Western Railway. On the surface, it was just another unremarkable 040 side tank engine with outside cylinders and joy valve gear. But on the inside, it featured a unique brick arch firebox and burned oil instead of coal, using oil firing equipment designed by William Holden. Water was stored in the side tanks as normal, while the fuel oil was stored in a saddle tank on top of the boiler. Originally, the locomotive was intended for use as a passenger engine on the Rington Vale Light Railway in North Somerset, but technical issues with the design led it to being rebuilt a month later before it even left Swindon Works. It had its firebox and oil burners modified, but when this didn't improve its performance, it was given a minor overhaul in 1903, being fitted with a Lentz boiler and having its saddle tank removed. Still proving to be difficult, the engine eventually had its oil-burning equipment removed and was converted into a coal burner in 1905. With its constant technical problems, the GWR simply kept the locomotive at Swindon, using it as a shunting and occasional pilot engine. 101 never got the chance to work on a mainline railway and was eventually scrapped in 1911. For any other engine, that would be that. Just another short-lived, dodgy experiment condemned to be no more than a footnote in some railway journal. And for 67 years, it was just that. But then, one day, something happened that gave this unique little engine a second lease on life. In 1978, Hornby decided to start producing cheap 00 gauge models of the Class 101 as the engine that would come with their starter train sets. Why they chose the Class 101 specifically, I'm unsure, but as a starter engine, it makes sense. Not only is it an 040 design, making it small and simple to manufacture, but historically the design was intended to pull passenger trains and occasional goods, so the model can be paired with most kinds of rolling stock and not look out of place. It's also likely that having big, square side tanks also appeals from a manufacturing point of view, as you've essentially got a nice, large, flat surface to print decals onto, be it the logo for the Great Western Railway or one of the many custom liveries Hornby has since printed onto the engine. The engine also happens to look quite nice in a lot of these custom liveries too, but whether this was a reason they picked the 101 or just happy coincidence is beyond me. I'd like to clarify that this is speculation on my behalf. I'm not really sure why Hornby chose the Class 101 as their default starter engine, it's just an educated guess. Regardless of why, intentional or not, Hornby brought a significant amount of attention back to the 101, possibly much more than it ever had while in service. All of a sudden, this random, one-off experiment that barely worked properly became a household name and icon for countless enthusiasts. People naturally wanted to know more about the engine and looked into it, learning of 101's story and sharing it with others. Whether or not you think it's a tragedy that a unique, one-of-a-kind engine like the 101 was scrapped, the fact that an engine which was considered a failure and hardly known to the public is now not only still known and talked about, but revered by many as the first model engine they ever got is pretty miraculous. It's fair to say few other engines are remembered in this way. Just goes to remind us that no matter how much we succeed or fail, we're still capable of being remembered fondly when we're gone. As long as there have been road vehicles, there have been people modifying and rebuilding them to run on railways. Most of the time this is done for fun or simply to cut corners, but it's often the case that a road vehicle modified to run on a railway is less effective than an actual purpose-built locomotive. There have been exceptions, however, the most effective of which involved traction engines. Born in 1824, Thomas Aveling became an apprentice to a farmer, and by 1851 ran his own farm in Ruckinge. In 1859, he noted how portable steam engines would have to be towed around by horses, and felt that it was a waste of time given that these engines could produce enough power to drive themselves. He modified a Clayton and Shuttleworth portable engine so that it was capable of moving under its own power, resulting in the first ever successful traction engine. The engine also had the power to plough, pull heavy loads, and kept its flywheel so it could power threshing machines, saws, and other farm equipment. After refining the design, he started his own company to sell the engines, eventually partnering with Richard Porter to create Aveling and Porter. Aveling continued to develop his machines, inventing the steamroller in 1867. While steamrollers and ploughing engines were their biggest sellers, like many other companies at the time, Aveling and Porter also decided to build railway locomotives too. Most other manufacturers would build locomotives from the ground up as locomotives. Aveling, however, felt that it would be easier to instead simply modify his existing traction engines by mounting a traction engine boiler onto a new set of frames and replacing their road wheels with flanged railway wheels. They produced a handful of small tank engines in 1865 for use on both standard and narrow gauge railways, initially using a 2-2-0 wheel arrangement, with the rear wheels using the same gearing and drive as their road-going counterparts. Aveling also produced an 040 design, using a chain to connect and power the driving wheels, though later designs swapped this out for a large gear instead. These engines mostly found themselves working in quarries, dockyards, harbours, and various tramways, but weren't quite as fast or as powerful as many other contemporary shunting engines, most rarely having more than 10 horsepower thanks to their small boiler and single cylinder. Their lack of oomph, however, was more than made up for with their practicality. Their gearing allowed them to tackle relatively steep grades with ease, their weight and size meant they could handle tight bends and poorly laid rails in quarries and harbours, and the engines retained their flywheels, meaning they could power auxiliary equipment such as stone crushers, grinding mills, and pumps if required, saving the need for extra stationary or traction engines to work on site. Their speed was rarely an issue anyway, as most places they worked required them to operate at low speeds. Despite their lack of horsepower, they were still able to handle heavy loads. It being noted they were able to haul 15 loaded wagons totaling 45 tons around the Gray's Chalk Quarry. Another aspect that made them popular was their affordability. Aveling and Porter's engines were cheap to build and modify compared to other industrial tank engines, most units costing about £530 each. They also consumed a minimal amount of fuel, most estimates working out to less than £5 of coal needing to be burned for every ton hauled. As such, the engines soon paid for themselves in fuel savings alone. And finally, what made them more preferable for industrial work than a standard engine was how easy they were to operate, as the locomotives possessed the same gearing and controls as road traction engines. As such, workers familiar with traction engines could easily operate them, and new workers could learn the controls quickly, meaning the company didn't need to hire qualified engine drivers. Aveling and Porter built just over 40 locomotives for industrial use, but most found their niche as shunting engines in quiet yards and quarries. As practical as they were, their lack of power led to many busy industries opting for more conventional shunting engines instead, as they were often faster, stronger, and made to keep up with a constant heavy workload. But for places such as gasworks, distilleries, and quarries, where only a handful of wagons would need shunting over a short distance, they were ideal. The last Aveling and Porter locomotive was built in 1926, though by this point the design was considered out of date. Regardless, a handful continued to work until the 1960s before finally being withdrawn. 5 of Aveling and Porter's locomotives have been preserved, including Sydenham that worked the Erith Oil Works, Sir Vincent that worked the British Oil and Cake Mills, and Blue Circle that worked the Holborough Cement Works. The Aveling and Porter locomotives, while certainly not the best shunting and short-distance engines to have been built, their simplicity, affordability, utility, and overall practicality made them a pretty useful asset on many railways. Considering they were the 19th century equivalent of bolting locomotive wheels to a tractor, they turned out pretty good. All that being said, just don't expect to make the next great shunting engine by swapping out your car's tires for some steel wheels. While fighting on the front lines, it's vital that troops are supplied with all the equipment they need to keep going. Naturally, this includes food, water, ammunition, and some recreational items. While fighting the First World War, many countries decided that what their troops really needed to aid them on the front lines were trains. Pretty soon after the conflict in Europe kicked off, most countries came to the realization that they needed an effective way to deliver supplies to the front lines. Established railways passing through the conflict zones were easy bombing targets, and most roads to the front lines were either destroyed or would be quickly ruined by the constant traffic. What they needed was something that could move large quantities of supplies that could also travel along the same route over and over without churning up the ground beneath it. So of course, they just chose to build loads of narrow-gauge railways. The Ducouville Manufacturing Company in France produced prefabricated segments of track for use on construction sites, farms, plantations, and various industries. The track could be very quickly and easily laid down, and the company sold various wagons that could be used to move around materials and supplies. The French military took an interest in the rail system and adopted it, primarily using 600mm gauge tracks around its strongholds to move troops, ammunition, and artillery pieces. The British War Department took an interest too and adopted a similar system. By the time war had fully broken out, these railways became essential. Because the tracks were in prefabricated segments, they could be easily laid by soldiers or inexperienced workers along the trenches and to and from the front lines. More stable rails were laid beside mainline railways so supplies could be easily transferred to the narrow-gauge trains. From there, they could be delivered to the trenches, and subsequently, any injured troops or damaged equipment could be moved out safely via the railway. If a line was targeted by enemy artillery or served a trench that was no longer being used, it could be very easily moved around or pulled up and replaced. Most of the wagons used on these railways were small and could be easily pushed by men or pulled by horse around the trenches, where the track segments tended to be too haphazardly placed for the locomotives to safely run on them. Eventually, Germany, Russia, and America adopted this system too. The locomotives that ran on these lines were primarily built by France, Britain, and Germany, However, the US helped by sending locomotives built by Baldwin and Alco. Most of these engines were built to be light, powerful, and easy to maintain, with the most common designs being 460 or 262 pannier tanks. Most of these engines were also fitted with short lengths of flexible pipe to allow them to refill with water from ponds, puddles, and flooded shell holes. Later, diesel engines were brought in to help, with some of them even being made out of modified Model T Fords. These engines were by no means fast, often described as moving at the speed of a light jog, but were still more than capable of doing the work asked of them. It was often the case that one side would capture enemy rolling stock and use it on their own railways. However, due to the lack of parts to maintain them, these engines were often used until they broke, where they were then either stripped down for parts or sent off for scrap. The engines also had a tendency to derail due to the poor quality of the tracks. However, their relatively light weight and size made them very easy to re-rail. Their main issue, however, was that the smoke and steam they produced made them very easy to spot by the enemy, and as such were heavily targeted. To get around this, most supply trains were either operated at night or during heavy fog. For daytime supplies, a locomotive would deliver them close to the front, and horses would pull the train the rest of the way. Eventually, daytime supply trips were made by the diesel locomotives that were brought in to help instead. These rail systems worked well, and by the end of the war, hundreds of miles of narrow gauge line had been laid all across Europe. Afterwards, most of these railways were used to help rebuild areas that had been destroyed by the conflict and eventually pulled up, with a few remaining as permanent lines. Most of the locomotives, rails and rolling stock was sold on as army surplus, finding a new life being used on plantations, farms and industries all over the world. A large number of these engines have since been preserved. In the end, trench railways were perhaps one of the more unsung heroes of the First World War. As weird as it seems to just throw down a railway line in the middle of a war zone, they did prove to be a massive help on the front lines, keeping the soldiers going. So, if you ever find yourself on the front lines, be sure to bring some railway tracks with you, as you never know how handy they could be. In the world of railways, bigger usually means better. Bigger driving wheels means higher speeds, bigger boilers means more reserved power, and bigger engines mean longer trains, which means more goods and passengers all being moved at once. Over in Britain, however, where engine size was very restricted, there exists one little engine which shows that size doesn't always matter. In 1936, the Courtaulds textile plant in Flint, North Wales, was in a strange predicament. The plant covered a large area near the sea, but the site was split into two by a railway line connecting Chester to Holyhead. Two tunnels were dug into the embankment to allow the plant to move people and supplies safely under the railway from one side to the other. However, the height of the embankment meant that the tunnel's roofs were very low. Like most large industries at the time, the plant had its own rails laid throughout the site, and some of them ran under the railway to help move supplies from one building to the other. The low clearance of the tunnels, however, was proving to be an issue, as in order to fit the wagons underneath to get from one side to the other, the ground had to be dug out so that the rails could be laid low enough to provide sufficient clearance. Wagons could now safely pass under the tunnel, but with only 6 feet of headroom, there was still the issue of actually moving them. As most conventional shunting engines would be far too tall to pass through the tunnel, a custom engine was ordered from Pecket and Sons to do the job. In order to decrease the engine's height, some extreme measures were taken. The wheels were only 2 feet in diameter, its cylinders were 8 by 12 inches, a standard saddle tank would have added too much extra height and so side tanks were opted for instead, its boiler and firebox was tiny, its footplate was positioned several inches below its running board, making the cab look as if it was sort of hanging off the back of the engine, and the cab itself was so small that the driver would have to be sat down to operate it. All of this resulted in a very small, compact 040 tank engine standing at a total of 5 foot 9 inches tall, which cost Courtaulds £840. To put that into perspective, the engine's total height was shorter than the diameter of the driving wheels of these locomotives. With a tractive effort of just over 4,800 pounds, despite its diminutive size, the engine was still more than capable of shunting trucks around the site. Courtaulds never gave the engine a number or a name, with most referring to it by its works number 1900. Though the engine had enough clearance to safely pass through, the tunnel still remained an issue. Because the ground had been dug out to provide more clearance, there was a sharp incline at both ends, meaning that the engine would need to work flat out in order to have enough momentum to climb the grade at the other side. One can imagine that with only 3 inches of clearance between the exhaust and the roof of the tunnel, there'd be a brief moment where the crew would get a face full of smoke, soot and steam. Eventually, by 1954, it was decided that it would be far better and safer to install a rope incline under the tunnel to pull the wagons with, and simply have a diesel shunter on both sides of the tunnel to move them around the site. As such, once the equipment was installed, 1900 was sent back to Pecket for repairs before being moved to Grimsby, where it shunted supplies around a new Courtaulds plant being constructed there. To make the engine more comfortable, the height of the cab was increased so that workers didn't have to sit at an awkward angle while driving it. The plan was for 1900 to work as a shunting engine around the plant once it was completed. However, Courtaulds opted to buy a Sentinel locomotive instead, keeping 1900 to one side as a spare. By 1971, Courtaulds had put the engine into storage and seemed to have little interest in using it again. Seeing such a unique engine no longer in service, the Quainton Railway Society decided to purchase it and restore it to working order. They removed the cab extension and fitted it with vacuum brakes so it could safely pull passenger trains, and by 1980 it was back in steam. Ever since, it's taken on a new life in railway circles as a fun little novelty, and despite its new owners giving it the name Jill, its size has led many rail fans to instead refer to it as the Flying Buffer Beam. Steam engines, like us, come in all shapes and sizes, and while the bigger engines are usually more striking and impressive, the fact that this strange, squat, one-of-a-kind shunter is beloved by so many just goes to show that you don't have to be the biggest or the best to be remembered. Sometimes, just being a little different is enough for people to love you. Subscribe for more.